we get started?
Okay. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
On my agenda is Ambassador Deborah first and then me. Has the order changed?
Hang on just a second. I can't hear you.
Strange.
Can you hear her through your?
Yeah.
So everyone else, other people can hear her when she's speaking?
Yeah, your mic is on, so.
I can hear you clearly.
My goodness, my apologies.
Welcome to the WTO.
Yeah, exactly. So much procedure. Joyce, you're going to be directly after me.
Oh, okay. Okay. Because I have it as I'm coming in second. That's fine. I can come in first.
Okay. So welcome everybody to this WTO public forum session this afternoon. So on behalf of the WTO, UNEP and the Forum on Trade, Environment and Sustainable and the SDGs, TESS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on trade and environment at MC12. How can governments work together at the WTO to support a green and fair global economy? My name is Carolyn Deer-Burback, and I'm the director of TESS, which is a partnership of the Graduate Institute and UNEP, and it's really an honor to be able to co-host this event today with the WTO and UNEP. And you'll hear more about their partnership on environment and trade, I'm sure, from our speakers. So we're pleased to have so many of you joining us today, especially online, and your interest demonstrates the importance and relevance of advancing discussion at the WTO on issues at the nexus of trade and sustainability. And indeed, there are really strong justifications for this interest. As an international community, we're facing a triple environmental crisis of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. And there are growing calls for trade and trade policies to better support international efforts to tackle these environmental challenges and to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So in an integrated global economy, we know that the environmental footprint of production and consumption is global. And so we need to ensure that our trade policies help support countries everywhere to promote more sustainability in their production, consumption, and trade. But achieving this will require massive economic transformation and, importantly, a just transition. We need to be conscious that many developing countries are keen to be strategic partners in this effort, but we'll need to ensure that our global economic policy frameworks and rules on investment and trade are both ambitious in terms of environmental impact, but fair, and that our efforts to develop new approaches to trade and environment issues reflect sustainable development priorities as well. And for those of you who've followed environment and trade for many years, you'll agree that this is an exciting time in terms of interest and engagement of countries in environment and trade issues. In its 25 plus years, this is a critical moment for the WTO and environment issues. Most clearly, we have a really historic opportunity to finally solve this issue of fisheries subsidies reform. And the good news is in the last 18 months, we've seen far more robust dialogue across the diversity of the WTO's membership on the intersection of trade, environment, and SDGs than we ever have before, and a recognition that strengthening multilateral approaches are vital. Just 18 months ago, I remember preparing for the original MC12, and there was a discussion about whether perhaps we could have a side event on environment and trade on the official agenda of MC12. And now we're talking about at least 3 different ministerial statements on different aspects of environmental issues. And I think that's a really exciting shift in emphasis at the WTO. So there's a sense that WTO has to be able to respond to key public policy challenges of our time. And this engagement on trade and environment is also driven by external circumstances and necessity. There are environmental impacts across the world's economies that are having economic impacts. Even without a trade policy dimension, markets and finance and consumers are driving the push for greener markets. Countries are implementing green policies, and some of these impact on trading partners, and businesses are adopting an array of different environmental standards. we can see that governments and businesses can see that there are opportunities in a greener economy, and they want to reap the rewards from participation in green supply chains. But there are also many, many tensions, trade-offs, trepidations, and as I mentioned before, the cost of transformation can be significant. So in the hope that we can help continue to build this conversation about how we can advance progress in this area, I'm really delighted to welcome our speakers today, who will give us a sense of what could be done here at the WTO to promote dialogue and hopefully action on these issues going forward. I'll start our session with remarks from our four speakers, and I'm delighted, I'll run through their names first. I'm delighted to welcome first Joyce Msuya, who is the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. She'll be followed by Jean-Marie Paugam, who is the Deputy Director General of the WTO, where his responsibilities lie on issues of environment and also agriculture and commodities. And then we'll turn to our two ambassadors today. First, His Excellency Stephen de Boer, who is the Permanent Representative of Canada to the WTO, followed by Jose Valencia, who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Ecuador to the WTO. So thank you all for joining us today, and also to Joyce. And I will turn then directly to Joyce. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And let me also recognize our friends at WTO, but also equally important, the ambassadors who are in this session. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. It is great to join this session virtually today. UNEP is honored to be hosting this event alongside our friends at the WTO and with the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. For years, UNEP and the WTO have worked closely to make global trade more sustainable and more equitable. That work is now taking on even more urgency. That's because humanity is staring down the barrel of not one, but three environmental crises, as Caroline has mentioned: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Unless we dramatically change our ways and make peace with nature, we risk destroying the natural systems that underpin human well-being. Unfortunately, global trade is currently contributing to the dire state of the planet. In a typical year, nearly 12 billion tons of oil, ore, and other commodities are taken from the earth and traded internationally. That resource extraction can lead to deforestation, water pollution, and other environmental impacts. In fact, UNEP data show that resource extraction accounts for 90% of biodiversity loss, 90% of water stress, and 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Trade can also cause a flow of waste to countries that do not have the capacity to manage it in an environmentally sound manner. This includes trading e-waste as well as trading plastic waste. In 2019, international trade across the life cycle of plastics was worth over $1 trillion, at least 5% of global trade. Tackling this issue is central to our efforts to tackle plastic pollution. Most of the goods traded are carried across borders by air, sea, or land transport. Greenhouse gas emissions associated with shipping, aviation, and road transport together account for 14% of global CO2 emissions in over the last decade. But trade can also be a balm for the planet. Smart, forward-thinking trade policies can help put humanity on the path to a greener future. So how can we make trade work for the planet instead of against it? We need to harness trade agreements to help eliminate subsidies that harm the environment. Fisheries subsidies, for example, are driving overfishing and harming the marine ecosystems on which billions of people depend for food and jobs. Thanks to the effort at the WTO, countries are close to agreement on addressing fishery subsidies. This is a must-have agreement for MC12. Agriculture subsidies, which are expected to reach almost $1.8 trillion by 2030, are another serious problem. A landmark report by UNEP and partners this year found out that over 2/3 of the estimated US dollars 540 billion provided per year in agriculture support is harmful to human health and nature. Many of these subsidies are encouraging deforestation, overuse of pesticides, and other chemical pollutants. Finally, perhaps the greatest immediate threat to humanity are the 500 to 600 billion US dollars in fossil fuel subsidies governments hand out annually. We are pleased to contribute to the work of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform that have demonstrated leadership and commitment to this issue at the WTO. As governments rebuild in the wake of COVID-19, they need to move away from destructive subsidies and towards trade policies that help people and planet. What form can those policies take? Well, here are several possibilities. Firstly, states can create incentives to encourage circularity. This means reusing raw materials and finished products instead of simply throwing them away. It also means designing products to be more resource efficient, recyclable, and reusable, and reducing the use of products that cannot be made more circular. For example, because they're made of hazardous or unrecyclable materials. Secondly, negotiators can ensure trade policies promote high environmental standards on sustainable agriculture, sustainable use of forests, and on low carbon production. Thirdly, trade pacts can restrict flows of environmentally sensitive or harmful products, like trade in waste, plastic products, and packaging that are not recyclable. Fourthly, trade policies can encourage the effective implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. These international accords govern everything from mercury pollution to the transport of hazardous wastes. Many governments face capacity constraints to effectively implement trade-related provisions of MEAs, and we must work on this together. Finally, trade deals can also include provisions for environmental cooperation, including on environmental impact assessments. I am happy to report that we are already starting to see more of these clauses in trade pacts. In 2018, each new trade agreement contained on average approximately 73 different environmental provisions. This is an important start, but we need to continue to build on this momentum. In just a few weeks, the latest United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, will be upon us. Greater cooperation on trade will be vital to meet the Paris Agreement goals. We need to ensure that trade is decarbonized, that we promote trade in climate-friendly goods and services like renewable energies, that we end export finance for fossil fuels and promote green trade finance. And we need to put in place trade policies that support adaptation and climate goals. So how do we strike a balance between the environment and the demands of the global economy? I would like to propose 4 keys. First, we need to work harder to align trade policy with sustainable development goals, the same kind of collaboration that we as UNEP have with the WTO. We need to see reflected at the country level. Secondly, we need to support the capacity of developing countries to design and implement trade policies that are green and sustainable and support their efforts to identify and pursue green business opportunities. We can do that by strengthening a focus on environmental activities, for example, in the Aid for Trade initiative. Thirdly, we must follow a principle of do no harm. Any trade agreement needs to be good for the environment, both today and in the future. No bilateral, regional, or multilateral trade agreement should ever undermine efforts to implement accords like the Paris Agreement or the Aichi targets on biodiversity. Lastly, we need leaders to push for a low carbon, resource efficient, circular economy, one centered on the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to do all these things and we need to do them quickly. The latest report from the IPCC released last month found that climate change is accelerating more rapidly than previously thought. We only have a decade to reduce carbon emissions. Trade and trade policies can be components in making peace with nature. At UNEP, we are delighted to see the environmental initiatives here at the WTO in the lead up to MC12. We applaud the efforts of governments to advance ministerial statements on trade and environmental sustainability, and on plastic pollution and on fossil fuel subsidy reform. Each of these statements offers an opportunity for governments to work together to forge a more sustainable global trading system. In the coming months, I hope these initiatives can attract the support of a wide diversity of the WTO's membership and catalyze stronger cooperation between environmental and trade ministers and stakeholders on sustainable trade. UNEP looks forward to strengthening our partnership with the WTO and to working with other international organizations like the ITC and UNCTAD to support sustainable and fair trade worldwide. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Joyce, for those remarks, for being so specific in terms of what you feel that should be done on trade policy, and also bringing UNEP's voice. I mean, UNEP is the voice of the environment in the UN family and in the international system. And it's really great to hear such a clear call about what the priorities should be and also how we can help advance those. So thank you so much for your remarks. Very welcome here today. So I'm now going to turn to the Deputy Director General of the WTO, Jean-Marie. You can tell us about how the WTO can contribute and what it's doing in this space.
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to co-host this event with UNEP, and thank you, Joyce, for your words. And I'd also like to thank Caroline for convening this meeting on behalf of TESS Undergraduate Institute and moderating this session. I want to stress how the partnership between the WTO and UNEP is long-lasting and is solid. It's not, it was not born with the last rain. Actually, it was already referred to in the Doha Declaration 20 years ago, and it has given birth to some joint products, joint effort, especially in the research field, such as the landmark report from 2009 on trade and climate change. I think it was probably a first of a kind, or the recent report on making trade work for the environment, prosperity and resilience, which was published in 2018. And also on the margin of one public forum like this one in 2018, the heads of WTO and UNEP have launched the first high-level dialogue on trade and environment. And since her appointment as a UNEP executive director, so the year after, Inger Anderson co-hosted a high-level event during our WTO Trade and Environment Week. So I'm just mentioning these as signals of the depth of this cooperation and this dialogue, which I think is more important than ever, especially this year where we are going to the WTO ministerial at the end of November. Why is this partnership really important? Because to some extent it has been said in great details by Joyce, but I would say that we see everywhere around the world a major change of paradigm upon the relation between trade and the environment. And this change has to do with two things. Is that historically the trade policy was looking at the environment as a cost, a tax, an obstacle to the flows of trade and the pursuit of growth. Now it is exactly the opposite which is happening. It is the unsustainable trade and unsustainable growth which is becoming an obstacle to trade itself. So there is something of a change. And the second element is that even legally speaking, in the architecture of the WTO, the environment was being seen as an exception to the rules. It was fully recognized that the environment had a superior value to trade, because it was Article 20 of the GATT. You could stop trade on behalf of the environment, but it was really outside of the architecture of trade. And now we are being looked at in the WTO and elsewhere exactly with the lenses that Joyce has been using about how trade can be a solution. So not an exception, but a solution to environmental problem. How can we harness this force toward solving environmental problem? And this is happening in the private sector, which I must say probably has 15 years ahead of institutional organization, including the WTO, in already under corporate social responsibility and other due diligences type of approaches. And through the technology is already transforming the nature of the production system in a more sustainable way. It is true also in green finance. It has been touched upon with a special effort led by some multilateral development banks. It is true in trade policy and especially in bilateral agreements. Joyce has mentioned some figures. The one I have in mind is that we count, I think, more than 270 bilateral agreements with strong environmental provision. So this is coming to the WTO, of course, a little bit slower, probably because we are a global institution. So we need to find consensus on the vision of what sustainability means. And it takes, of course, more time when you speak at the scale of the world, but it is coming really. And this year is a little bit like Elvis Presley would sing, "It's now or never." If I may say so, because we have three initiatives which are clearly for our ministerial placed under the sign of the environment. The first one is our overarching priority because it's a sustainable development objective. It is fisheries and the reform of fisheries subsidies. You know that this negotiation has been ongoing for the last 20 years. It has been raised to the level of an SDG. The purpose of the negotiation is essentially to eliminate subsidies which contribute to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. I need to explain one little point about that. There is no subsidy which ex ante help the illegal fishing. It's just if a boat is being subsidized and is practicing the illegal fishing that you take off the subsidies. I have had time to explain that to a minister why. So that's why I precise. It's really the boat is being subsidized and then it does something illegal, so we sanction it. So that's the first key point. It's very, very, very important because illegal fishing is not an anecdotal element. It is probably affecting up to 1/3 of the boats which are in the high seas. And the second key objective is to reform the subsidies which are contributing to depleting the resource through overfishing or overcapacity. We are now in the last run of the negotiation under the leadership of our chair, Ambassador Santiago Wills. We really need to do anything we can, and speaking in a public forum where there are constituents from civil society, businesses, institutions. I think we need your help to push the government toward the most ambitious agreement that we could reach. There are two other initiatives. One is on plastic, which has been led by a group of our members a few years ago. It's being developed. I will not go into the details because Ambassador Valencia, I suppose you would mention it. Let me just remind that one aspect of our partnership with UNEP has been specifically working on this topic through co-organizing, or at least we were hosting, but UNEP was organizing the preparatory meeting for the UNA conference, which may launch a global negotiation on plastic. And one thing one ghost that I want to slay is that these processes could be competing. They are recognized fully complementary in the WTO and in UNEP, by UNEP and by our stakeholders. So there is a room for trade to contribute to a more holistic approach of how to eliminate plastic pollution through trade policy. The other one, and the most comprehensive one, is what we call TESS, Structured Discussion on Trade and the Environment, which is another plurilateral discussion which has been started by some of our members, which should lead, and I speak and I will defer to Ambassador Debord, my good friend Ambassador Debord, to let us know whether we have a hope for a ministerial declaration in MC12 on this. But at any rate, many things are happening. I'm not even mentioning what is happening inside the technical committees of the WTO, sometimes under the radar. For instance, the WTO is not has nothing on its agenda to talk about climate change. That's okay. We do not have a mandate from our members, but climate change, you would find it in most of our technical discussion on agriculture, on agricultural subsidies. You have arguments which are being made about the impact on climate change. On trade in goods, you have the question of the border tax adjustment, which is being raised. On technical barriers to trade, you have a lot of measures which are being notified to this organization, which have to do with climate change. So the issue of sustainable development is really there. And the question is to see whether our members will want to move forward, one step forward in terms of promoting an agenda in the organization. I stop here, Caroline, and thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean-Marie, for giving us that context of how things look from inside the WTO, and also for cheering for an end for the fisheries subsidies reform negotiations. I'm going to turn directly now to Ambassador Debord to help us explain how this ministerial statement can help work here at the WTO and cooperation on these issues.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and join today's discussion. And I should tell you that this is my third speaking engagement this week on environment at the WTO. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because it obviously is a topic that merits an enhanced profile. And it's obviously a topic of great interest, and that is great to see. The questions that we are addressing at today's session are important questions. Everybody here today recognizes that countries cannot address today's pressing climate and environment issues by acting in isolation. Multilateral efforts will be key to our ability to tackle these challenges. It's also clear that environmental issues cannot be resolved in a single forum. There are many multilateral organizations that can and must have a role in responding to environmental and climate issues. And it's Canada's belief that the WTO can play an important role in this process by ensuring that trade and environmental objectives and policies are mutually supportive. In the past few years, there's been a rapid increase in activity on environmental and sustainable issues at the WTO. Building on the long-standing work at the Committee on Trade and the Environment, members have come together in recent years to engage on a number of environmental issues. The broad range of these discussions is a testament to the level of interest among the membership. It's clear that members see a role for the WTO in tackling environmental challenges. It's been a pleasure to see this work accelerate over the past few years. I'd like to take a moment to speak in my capacity as the co-convener of TESTI, or the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, a role which I share with Ambassador Peralta of, Abraham Peralta of Costa Rica. When the structured discussions were first launched in November 2020, the 53 interested members expressed their goal of intensifying discussions on environmental issues and themes. And they also hoped, where appropriate, to put forward concrete deliverables, initiatives, and next steps to advance work on environmental issues at the WTO. Over the past year, we've had an opportunity to hear from the membership about their priorities and aims for the future of these discussions. Our hope is that we can come forward at MC12 with a strong statement which will reaffirm the commitment to advancing environmental issues at the WTO. We also want to highlight areas for future discussion and to lay out a roadmap to implement the activities described in the statement. Ideally, we would like to see the number of signatories expand beyond the original number and bring together a broad range of members at all levels of development. The TESTI discussions are open to any member, whether or not they are a co-sponsor. Nevertheless, we hope that more members will see their interests reflected in the statement and that they will want to come to the table formally to help us drive these discussions. Finding areas of common interest for members will be key in advancing the work across all of the environmental discussions. The next challenge will be to turn these discussions into concrete action. This is an area where I think that stakeholders can provide strong value in the process. We benefit from the new ideas that NGOs, international organizations, and the private sector bring to the table. We also benefit from their ongoing engagement and calls for action as we try to maintain the momentum for change. TESTI has welcomed the direct participation of stakeholders, and we're been very pleased by the open exchanges that this has allowed. I also believe that stakeholder engagement in multiple places can have great value. Outreach is not only important here in Geneva, but also in national capitals. The more that governments hear from their stakeholders among NGOs and businesses about the need for action, the greater the pressure becomes for governments to deliver. By keeping up the pressure and bringing a wide range of voices to the table, we will have the best chance of creating real change. With that in mind, MC12 will be a great opportunity for WTO members to demonstrate their commitment to the environment and to signal their intent to enhance discussions on the overlap between trade and environmental policies and objectives. We have an opportunity to demonstrate that the world of trade and the WTO more specifically can contribute to global efforts to combat the climate and environmental sustainability challenges that the world faces today. I look forward to seeing the outcomes at MC12, and I'm even more keen to see how members are able to translate those outcomes into future action as we move beyond MC12. And thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with you. I'm going to thank you in advance for engaging with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I also really thank you for that emphasis on how stakeholder engagement in this work can help and advance and strengthen it, especially as we're here at the public forum. That's really useful. And I would underline too that it's something of an innovation with both of these new initiatives, that there has been more emphasis on stakeholder engagement in various forms than we have seen at the WTO before in some of its activities. So that's really an innovation in itself for those of you studying the history of the WTO and its negotiations. I'd like to turn directly now to Ambassador Valencia, who is, as Jean-Marie mentioned, he's one of the co-conveners of the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. Please tell us more about that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. It's good to have very good company here at this table, and of course here in this room at the WTO, and the friends and other colleagues that are attending online this panel. Well, we, the World Trade Organization members, must multiply our work and initiatives on trade and environmental agenda. I think we are pretty clear on that. Promoting a more sustainable world and protecting our global environment is a crucial and permanent task for all individuals, nations, and institutions. The triple crisis that Caroline mentioned at the opening of this meeting, climate change, environmental loss, and pollution, are evident and dramatic challenge for all. Having this in mind, Ecuador is a co-convener and sponsor of the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmental sustainable plastics trade, IDP, which was established by a group of WTO members in 2020, 1 year ago. The IDP started out by identifying a global challenge for coordinated action to address the rising environmental, health, and economic costs of plastics pollution and the importance of the trade dimension as a part of a solution. Ecuador has witnessed firsthand the negative impact of plastic pollution in one of our most precious natural reserves, the Galapagos Islands. Although the government has established long-term programs to protect the wild sanctuary, plastics keep coming, carried away by the ocean currents. The increased level of microplastic pollution is a constant in Galapagos and everywhere in our sea waters. Plastic pollution is a global problem that needs a global, comprehensive, and coordinated response. There are opportunities for all of us to transit to a more circular economy on plastics. Ecuador is active on this matter in multiple fora, regional and international processes. Coming back to the WTO, I would like to mention that 18 country members developing, developed, and least developed economies are currently co-sponsors of the IDP and are very active in exchanging our views, ideas, and experiences in this area. We aim to identify opportunities for enhanced trade cooperation within the rules and mechanisms of the World Trade Organization to support domestic, regional, and global efforts to reduce plastic pollution and facilitate the transition to a more circular and environmentally sustainable global plastics economy. Co-conveners of the initiative are currently Australia, Barbados, China, Ecuador, Fiji, and Morocco, and the 18 members who currently co-sponsor the informal dialogue are Australia, Barbados, Cabo Verde, Canada, Central African Republic, China, Costa Rica, Ecuador once again, Fiji, Gambia, Jamaica, Kazakhstan, Morocco, New Zealand, Switzerland, Russia, Thailand, and the United Kingdom. As you can see, there's a broad variety of nations from different parts of the world. All of us are, I believe, committed to the same goal, to the same purpose. By the way, we believe that the IDP has complementarities with trade and environment structure discussions. Ambassador De Boer informed earlier the working of TESS at the WTO. Both initiatives share a common goal of positioning the importance of trade and environment to reflect all members' interests and views. The IDP, of course, is concerned with the specific urgent problem of plastic pollution. I am repeating plastic pollution here and there, but that's the point. We have to put this in the right mind frame for everybody. The IDP is open to all WTO members. In fact, at our meetings, we have received multiple opinions and criteria from various members. The initiative has also benefited from other sources' perspectives. I'm referring to multiple stakeholders approach that have reached the expertise and different organizations, academia, and the private sector, as well as NGOs that have been also supporting our initiative and apporting with the ideas and criteria. This dynamic participation has produced a rich and diverse debate, reflected in the quantity, diversity, quality, breadth of topics covered, and a way forward for the problems. The discussions have revolved around 6 subjects. The first one, improving transparency and monitoring trade trends. Second, promoting best practices. Third, cooperating with other international processes and efforts. Fourth, identifying the scope for collective approaches. Fifth, strengthening policy coherence. And finally, assessing capacity and technical assistance needs. In the road for the next ministerial conference of the WTO, we have taken stock of the discussion on the mentioned 6 aspects, and in that direction, we are preparing a draft statement based on the elements we circulated with all the members on September the 8th. We welcome all comments and views on this matter. Our declaration will also include identified issues that can guide our work next year. This will project the topic's importance, the co-sponsors' political will, and the relevance of trade and trade policy in this sphere. The IDP is a platform at the WTO to foster our organization's support on ongoing and future efforts to address plastic pollution from the trade perspective, including identifying challenges, opportunities for developing countries in the circular economy. Last September, a ministerial meeting of environmental authorities took place at the WTO. Jean-Marie Bogan also mentioned this very important event that took place in the same headquarters of the WTO. It is clear, a sign is clear, a demonstration that complementarity works, and that we have to encourage that cooperation and connection between different multilateral institutions, that we are all committed to the same goal from different perspectives. In the case of the WTO, of course, from the trade perspective. I would like to stress the synergies that we have consolidated with UNEP, VRS, and UNTAD on the road to MC12, discussing issues relevant to plastics pollution and the circular economy. I conclude my remarks by noting the importance of this collaborative effort between developing and developed nations, between countries from all regions, and with economies of different sizes to address a specific common issue. Ecuador invites more members to join this informal dialogue and comment on the elements of an eventual ministerial document that will be circulated to the WTO membership. Finally, I commend the work of the structured discussions and welcome this invitation. We consider that this House has a fundamental role in the issues of the current global agenda. I would like to quote Susan Gardner, Director of Ecosystems at UNEP, last September at our event on how the WTO can contribute to the UNEA process. She noticed that, quote, "What is good for the environment is good for business," end of quote. I would add to the reflection of Director Gardner that we also must jointly work in a coordinated way to help businesses and trade effectively contribute to the conservation and promotion of sustainability. The WTO, the World Trade Organization's commitment to deal with the challenge of plastic pollution from a trade perspective will undoubtedly support the building of a more sustainable world. In following IDP dialogue, a new one will take place on October the 22nd. Our fellow co-convener, Australia, will be chairing and focus on the discussion on the draft ministerial declaration to reach out the members to endorse the MC12 ministerial declaration as well. Thank you once again for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And if I may just commend you, I think one of the things that I find personally very inspiring about the IDP process is that it was originally led by developing countries, which is really a first in the WTO system. It's an issue that they've identified as one that is trade related, that has economic impacts and environmental impacts, and where we can make a contribution here at the WTO. But moreover, I think the really wonderful thing is you've attracted both developed and developing countries to this cause, and the diversity of the membership, and that amazingly you managed with 6 co-conveners of very different sizes and shapes in terms of economic interests. So I think it's really a testament to how it's possible to get work done collaboratively at the WTO. I will open the floor to questions in just a minute. While you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to throw 3 out there to our panelists. And the first thing I wanted to say is that we weren't able to include today an introduction to the statement on fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is actually predates these other 2 statements as an initiative at the WTO. And that's simply because at the public forum, you're only allowed to have 4 speakers. So if we've been able to have 5, I would have had them here to present their statement as well. But just to note, that is out there and is obviously an extremely important issue as well for the WTO climate and trade agenda. But I was on the climate and trade agenda, I was reminded, as many of you are, by the words of Greta Thunberg in the recent days, where she accused governments of blah, blah, blah on climate and trade, and that there are so many words, but not enough action. And so it would be interesting to hear from you in the context of the many challenges we have at the WTO. What would success look like for you in your role as a DDG, but also for the 2 ambassadors in those initiatives? What are some realistic expectations we could have in terms of impact. And of course, from stakeholders out there, they're really interested in seeing environmental impact and environmental change. So I think it would be helpful for us to set out what would success look like. And I'd be very interested also in how you see, Ambassador Palgam, the link between this work and the regular work of the WTO that really involves all members through the committees and so on. What kind of synergies and can we see between those that will support this wider discussions in the WTO? And then finally, for Joyce, if you could give us some sense of how really UNEP can support environmental ministries and stakeholders, particularly at the national level in developing countries, to identify their interests in this debate and to really make sure that their trade ministries are equipped to fight for their national interests in this area and to advance discussions in ways that work for their development goals. So there's some general, I'm throwing them out so you can think about them. Maybe we should answer those, and I'll look for hands if I see any as we're going forward. Perhaps I could start first with you, Ambassador Palgam. Yes, please. And outcomes.
Okay.
And success.
Yeah, exactly.
And success. On the synergies, I think I touched upon the question implicitly in my initial intervention. What everyone should keep in mind is that what is not happening in the WTO doesn't mean that it's not happening. It's not because you don't want to talk here that it's not happening. And in the environment, it's extremely impressive to see that the dynamic, we do not have putting fisheries apart, but we don't have a real negotiation on environment or a holistic approach on environment, but environment is popping up everywhere. And the best place to see that is our technical barriers to trade committee, because this is where our members do notify their measures, their unilateral measures, which have an environmental related objective. It can be subsidies for an environmental objective. It can be standard, most of the time is standards and regulation. It can be also sometimes a direct trade measures like an import control or something. And here we have a database. So this is completely objective. This is not wishful thinking from anywhere. We can see on that database that the trend is growing. More and more measures are being notified by our members. And we can see that this is accelerating. In the last 4 years, we had probably the equivalent of half of what has been done in the last 10 years. And we can see also at the granular level, things which are very interesting is that the topic, and you mentioned that, Carolina, I think the topic is not a north-south divide, like the environment is a rich country's concern and the poor country would think differently. You can see that on some topic, it's really a unifying dimension. For instance, plastic is really one of those where 50% of what is being notified to us comes from developing countries. On forest, same thing, your preservation of the forest and biodiversity. So this is where the synergies can be built on, because we have a lot of materials in this discussion. And this is where the choices have to be made, whether we want that to keep it fragmented, popping up a little bit on there, or if we think that it's more useful at one point to try to discuss, to put that on the agenda for discussion to avoid fragmentation. And to some extent, I come to the question of success. I think that the fact of moving from a passive position of the WTO, where we just have that happening all around the place, and then sometimes it comes to us, to a proactive wheel of discussion to prevent fragmentation of this world under the environmentalist policy, I think that would be already a success. And that's the inspiration that I detect behind underlying the TESS initiative or the IDP initiative. You're right, the fossil fuel subsidy reform. And I think this is not blabla. This is let's talk. You have one very big example of that, which is an elephant in the room, which is a CBAM from the European Union. We think, and the DG of this organization has been very clear. We think that the global carbon price would be the first best approach to solving the climate problem. Now, absent this first best, you have countries which are moving because they want to move unilaterally. And then the question of WTO compatibility is raised. And then the question is, do you want to talk about that or don't you want to talk about that? Do you want to solve the problem by cooperation or do you want to go to litigation? And this is an open question. As a secretariat, I have no opinion. The members just have, I never have any opinion as a secretariat, but the members have to choose what course of action. So I think setting this agenda would be, for me, the criteria for success. I've been too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. I mean, I think part of your point is that, in fact, cooperation itself, the will to cooperate, is actually a success in the multilateral context as well as a first step. And we shouldn't underestimate, I think, how hard that is to get. The will to cooperate and the will to engage is an important first step. But Ambassador de Boer, give us your views, please.
Well, I was very much struck by something that Jean-Marie said earlier on in his first intervention. I'm going to use WTO speak here, where we used to see trade traditionally and environment or trade getting in the way of environmental policy making, and now we're seeing the opposite, where environmental policy making is critical for economic development and not a stumbling block to economic development. So that is a very important discussion to have. And I don't think that we're all there yet. I think that within the context of the WTO, there still is somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction to environmental regulation and environmental measures to say, oh, you can't do that. You're trying to create a competitive advantage for yourself and disadvantage me. So what I like a lot about TESTI is having those conversations, and the conversation doesn't necessarily have to mean rulemaking. It doesn't have to mean a new agreement, but the discussion is very important. Let's take CBAM as an example. CBAM is driving discussions here, but it's also it's a useful reminder that there are trade policy responses to deal with climate change that are perfectly consistent with the existing rules. And Jean-Marie referred to one of them, and that would be a carbon tax. Completely consistent with our national treatment commitments. CBAM is trying to address another issue that comes up as a result of that, but still it's useful to have the conversation and to remind ourselves as members that we have levers here within the existing rule book to address this. And again, Jean-Marie is absolutely right. These discussions are happening in other places. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean that members aren't talking about climate change, for example, or environmental measures, but they may not be talking about it here. And so having the discussion here, even if it doesn't result in new rules, is important to ensure that synergy. So I would say success at MC12 for us means that we have as many members as possible supporting the TESTI declaration and those discussions, and that we move forward with those discussions on a range of issues, including fossil fuel subsidy reform, including plastics, including climate change, and that we then decide after that, what do we do with this? Do we have the rules that we need? Do we need to modify? Do we need a new set of rules? There's a second thing that we need to have out of MC12, and that is we do need to have a fishery subsidies agreement that is related to the environment, that is going to get us over the line with respect to SDG 14.6.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that comment. I'm just going to pass one that we have from some of the listeners on the screen. I'm just going to quickly throw back to you because I've had this question several times this week, is that would the WTO, is there any effort to create a kind of working group at the WTO on trade and climate or climate initiatives? And to my mind, these are issues you're hoping that can be discussed in the context of TESTI, but perhaps you could address that, because I think that's a question that stakeholders have an interest in.
Well, to be quite honest, TESTI is trying to create a structure for those discussions. There is a risk that we'll have a plethora of smaller discussions that will not be particularly challenged. And will be particularly challenging. And if we have too many discussions going on at the same time on similar themes, we're going to create this lack of synergy problem that we're already talking about between other multilateral institutions and the WTO. So ideally, it would take place, and we call it structured discussions because we want to create that umbrella where these things will occur. I don't want to prejudice the outcome of what happens to those discussions post MC12 and what that looks like. But I think it's important that we try to have those discussions in one tent.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, I guess one of the things we need to do in the coming months, and when you have a draft statement, this will really help us to help stakeholders out there understand what's really in it and what the intentions are. And I think we should be able to see, we'll certainly all see that at MC12, and that will create some more clarity. But in the WTO discourse, it is referred to already as a joint statement initiative of the WTO. So those who are looking for something on climate at the WTO, you do have this as a place where climate issues will be discussed. And also there's the fossil fuel subsidy reform discussion as well. I don't see any hands. Oh yes, Andreas, and there's one at the back. We've only got a few minutes, so please be concise. Thank you. Great. I will just quickly repeat that for those who didn't hear it online. The question was from the Center for International Environmental Law, and it referred to the fact that in the ministerial declaration from the plastic meeting earlier this month, there was a reference to the importance of reducing virgin plastic production, which is based on fossil fuel feedstocks. And there was a question of how and whether this issue might be tackled in the context of either the fossil fuel subsidy reform statement or in the plastic pollution dialogues process. So I might turn that to Ambassador Valencia. Thank you.
Well, I should say that your question was very, very, very relevant to this discussion. Is a sort of a demonstration of the need that we all have to advance this cooperation and interaction between different fora that are dealing with this issue. You know. So how we are starting this discussion here at the WTO, and we need, in order to find those coincidences, you know, to work together. Now the IDP is, as I said in my presentation, concentrated in plastic pollution. You know, whether the TES initiatives, the TES discussions are broader, has a broader start. We have to combine both. We don't see them as two different dynamics, but some sort of, at one point we have to merge and we have to have this connection in order, for example, to tackle the points and that you mentioned, Mr. De Castillo. So we certainly look forward to work on that. And now the IDP is circulating in the draft, you know, elements for the ministerial conference, ministerial meeting. And we hope that we'll be able to, for example, this issue will be solved among all the members of the WTO. This is a common effort, is an effort, a multilateral effort, and we believe that good ideas maybe take some time, maybe it's a little bit of blah blah over there, but in the end, if we all do our best, we'll achieve very good results and go from words to deeds. That's the goal. Finally, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Well, I think we've reached our 4 o'clock limits, and I wanted to respect the time of our speakers and thank them for coming today. So first, let's just thank them for their time. Thank you very much. And also for your efforts, all 3 of you, and of course to Joyce at UNEP for your efforts to promote this agenda in the WTO context. I wanted quickly just to close by just mentioning on the virgin plastic point, because I'm an academic and love data, is that we should note that 54% of primary plastic production in the world, so virgin plastic production produced, is traded internationally. So trade is a major factor in the primary plastics world. But just to turn to close, I hope that this discussion today has helped those of you listening to have a sense of what's happening in the multilateral trade arena on issues of environment, and hopefully inspires you to indeed engage at the national level with your government officials, with other stakeholders, to spur IGOs and others to do the research that is needed and academics to push these agendas forward. And there's surely a lot of work that needs to be done to analyze where countries' interests lie, where solutions lie, where policy options could be pursued. I think one of the key things, and it was alluded to briefly by the Deputy Director General, was this idea that there are real competitive issues at stake here at the WTO as well. And it's one of the reasons why it makes it so hard, because you have an environmental imperative and you have many different economic interests at stake, and they're hugely diverse. I think one of the key things as we're looking forward is to realize that if we're going to make a greener global economy, it has to be one in which all countries can prosper and thrive. So we have to find ways that everyone can be a player in this green global economy, and that we don't have a certain set of countries marginalized from that, either in terms of their trade prospects or of their technology prospects. So it's really going to involve a cooperative approach if we want to achieve these climate and other environmental objectives that we have. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for having the time to be with us today. And thank you to UNEP and WTO for co-hosting this event. And let me close there and encourage you to explore other environment and trade events that are on at the WTO Public Forum today and tomorrow. Thank you. We're in another event.